Welcome back to the Space Alvey Institute podcast. I'm Andrew Petiprin with Bobby Mixa. Bobby, good to see you.
Good to see you, Andrew. How's Texas?
It's good. Before we started recording, we were talking with each other and with our guest, whom I'll introduce in just a moment, about the weather, which is pretty much the way we always begin, isn't it?
Yeah, but also the fact that we're, three bald guys, and I'm looking a little bit more, like my teacher every single year, which is a good thing.
Yes, you can see how distinguished you're going to look someday.
Yes, we were just discussing how not only our guest today, who is Michael Hanby, but some of our other guests in the past, we've tended to kind of have three images on the screen that are kind of not too dissimilar from each other. So without further ado, let me go ahead and say a word of welcome to our guest, Michael Hanby, who is a return visitor to the Space Alvey Institute podcast. To say, Bobby, that you and I are fans of Michael Hanby's work is definitely an understatement. We're big fans of your work, Professor Hanby, maybe your biggest fans. So welcome back to the podcast.
I didn't even know I had fans. Now I have two. That's great. Thanks.
You have at least two.
It's great to be with you guys again. It's always a lot of fun.
Thanks. Well, the occasion for having you back, or your occasion for receiving our invitation to come back, is Bobby and I were really we just had a lot of thoughts about a talk that you gave recently, which is appropriately called Artificial Ignorance, and we want to dive into that a little bit with you today. Artificial intelligence and kind of problems of technology are things we've talked about quite a bit on our podcast. You've talked with us before about those very issues, but I think this talk that you've given, which is available to read online, and we'll provide the link to that in our show notes, presents us with some new avenues to explore. So I think let's go down those avenues, and maybe we could begin with this. You call your piece "Artificial Ignorance," which is obviously a very appropriate and provocative term. It occurred to me as I was reflecting on what I read in your talk that to propose something like artificial intelligence proposes that there's such a thing as real intelligence. And something that comes through in your article is just like, we're a bit confused about what that is to begin with, which sort of creates the problem of what do we do with this phenomenon of artificial intelligence. So let me throw it to you with that thought, and let's get the ball rolling.
Sure. Well, maybe I should give just a little bit of background to this. The occasion for this talk, which I was never actually able to give, actually. There was a death in the family that prevented me from going to the event where I was supposed to give this talk, so I sent it along, and my friend David Schindler read it for me. But the occasion for this was a symposium convened by some friends of our institute at who are physicians at the Mayo Clinic, which once began many years ago as a partnership between an order of Catholic sisters and some local doctors there, and that history has evolved or devolved as the case may be in some interesting directions. But they continue to try and address issues of medicine and faith. So the reason I bring that up is that the particular focus of the piece in question is the relationship between artificial intelligence and medicine. They had asked me to speak on that. Now, let me see, after that long preamble, if I can recall your question. It had to do with our confusion about the nature of human intelligence, right? Which makes artificial intelligence, the idea of an artificial intelligence, intelligible.
Yeah, that's right. And I was just kind of rambling a little bit on my own, but you begin your talk making this point from Jonas, I guess, who says, I'll just read what you say here. You say that there's an irresistible human temptation to understand our machines in the image of the human functions they replace, and then to understand the replaced human functions in the image of the artifacts that supplant them. And so maybe I'll throw that to you to kind of tell us a little bit about the problem at the heart of artificial intelligence, I suppose, or how we think of it.
Well, fundamental problem that I was trying to get at in this particular piece, and I should say there are many layers of problems, right, that artificial intelligence present. I tried to touch on several of them. I don't mean to suggest that the problem with AI or the problems are exhausted by this critique. There are all kinds of worries, not the least of which is that we've created something powerful whose permutations we can't anticipate, and so we don't even know what all we should be worrying about. But the fundamental problem that you allude to, the transformation in the human and the understanding of intelligence as such that underlies this, a reduced understanding of intelligence that's very old, that goes back now several centuries to the advent of the scientific and technological revolutions, and to the overthrow, as it were, of the ancient Greek and Christian tradition, which saw contemplative understanding, and therefore saw understanding, right? The understanding of the truth and the meaning of things as not only the proper object of reason, but really as the proper goal of human life. Well, long about the 17th century, that gets overthrown in favor of a vision of reason that is calculating on the one hand, and experimental on the other hand. And you can recognize the two faces of modern science in that overthrow. And of course, any reconception of reason contains within it, even if it's not spelled out explicitly, and someone like Francis Bacon does spell it out explicitly, contains at the same time a reconception of the object of reason, namely truth. And so what happens at the beginning of the 17th century is that reason ceases to be thought of principally as contemplative, that it is best realized in understanding, and that the object of understanding is being itself, an order of reality that is inherently and deeply meaningful. And instead, reason comes to be conceived as a kind of calculating, a kind of engineering, whose object is a machine-like world, and our reason is verified, as it were, or the truth of our reasoning is realized when we are able to achieve certain things, when we are able to manipulate nature in ways that we can predict, or that we can control, or that allows us to realize possibilities that heretofore were impossible. And my argument in this piece is essentially the idea of artificial intelligence, which is a curious idea when you stop and think about it. And I try to illustrate this with a couple of examples in the piece, because it's an intelligence that actually does not actually involve thinking or understanding, and does not involve or even contain a capacity to reach a judgment about what is true in more than a kind of calculative sense or a functional sense. And so it's a curious notion of intelligence that involves no thinking, no understanding, no judgment about the ultimate nature or meaning of things, and instead is calculation on a large scale, or the assemblage and analysis of facts on a large scale. And so, on the one hand, the problem is that artificial intelligence is already a reflection of a reduced understanding of human intelligence. But on the other side of Jonas's vicious circle, as I called it in that piece, on the other side is the idea that image of reason, which artificial intelligence exemplifies most perfectly, comes to be the archetype or the image in which we understand what it means for us to reason, which means we then adopt and normalize and make pervasive a form of reason that doesn't really involve thinking, that doesn't really involve understanding, that doesn't really involve judgments, insofar as we can avoid them, judgments about the true nature or meaning of things, and that has as its object a world in which there is no real nature or meaning to things. What's left then is a world that is, on the one hand, a world that is endlessly manipulable, right? That anything. Hannah Arendt has a great quote in her book on the origins of totalitarianism that I don't think I use in this particular piece, but she defines as one of the conditions of totalitarianism a world in which people sense that everything is possible and nothing is true. That's a pretty apt description of the world that I'm trying to describe here, a world in which anything at least seems possible. You can only find out in the trying, of course, but in which judgments about what is true and therefore ultimately what is good are unintelligible, and we rapidly lose the capacity to make them. And so with that problem on the table, what I attempted to do in this piece is reflect a little bit, and it was meant to be a very short talk and kind of an informal one. The setting was more discussion based, but what I tried to do in that talk was to reflect a bit on the implications of that becoming that vision of reason and of the world becoming normative for medicine.
Yeah, Dr. Hanby, that Hans Jonas quote that you have in your piece, it's the last part there, which is, about we start to think about ourselves. We understand human functions in the image of the artifacts that supplant them. What's interesting about that is maybe perhaps what you could say is say a little bit more about how artificial intelligence just kind of reiterates these things. So we make the machine, and then the machine in some ways makes us. And in your piece, it seems like what you're really saying is that the real danger is not so much the technology, which is really a danger, but it's this, in some ways, this way of thinking about these things that the technology is just kind of reinforcing, namely about ourselves. So could you say a little bit about that? Because it seems like the danger of this is really in the way of thinking.
Yeah, well, it's I would think of it as a both and rather than an either or. Many of the other concerns that people have voiced about AI, that these systems become somewhat autonomous, or they at least become difficult. Once we are dependent upon them, we're governed by their algorithms rather than govern them. So, our ability to alter the things we've set in motion, the various systems that we've put in place. I tell a funny story that illustrates this. I will come back to I have not lost track of the principal danger here, but I tell a story that I think is funny, at least, where my wife and I were out to dinner one night, and she decided to order a gin and tonic without the gin. In other words, tonic water. And we waited and we waited and we waited and we waited, and nothing came. And we could see over at the bar of this restaurant that all of these servers and people were huddled around the computer, trying to figure something out, which they couldn't figure out. Finally, after an extremely long and frustrating wait, the server came back and told us that they didn't have tonic water. I'm sure they're pouring gin and tonics hand over fist over at the bar, but this was their report to us. And what they really meant is that the system had no way to charge for a glass of tonic water without the gin. And it's a trivial story, but it exemplifies, I think, what happens. You have this experience on occasion when you attempt to deal with a real human being who happens to work for an airline, and they're at the mercy of what their computers will allow them to do. So they'd like to make a change for you. A human making a proper human judgment ought to be able to make this kind of change for you. But an algorithm or a policy is inscribed into the machine in such a way that it's not possible, and we're entirely reliant on the system. So all of those things are dangers. I don't mean to say that's not the real danger. When we live in a more fully AI automated world, it's going to be it's going to be like living in customer service. The inaptly named sphere of life. But yes, there's a deep concern both that artificial intelligence as an archetype of what we mean by intelligence, in some sense, dehumanizes us. What I'm really concerned about here is the reduction of the human being and of human reason. That we no longer we're on this point, on the verge of this already, I think, and the further collapse of the humanities and education will undoubtedly hasten it, where the capacity to think about what is true and what is good is simply unintelligible to us, and we lack the means to do it. This is the part of the difference between education and conditioning. Conditioning deprives you of the aptitudes and not only the aptitudes, but just the qualities that heretofore defined and differentiated us as human. If we come to view our intelligence in the image of something that is itself less than human, even though it can calculate on a superhuman scale, we will inevitably become less than fully human. I think that's a deep concern. That's the concern I was trying to articulate. But there's another facet to it as well, and that concerns what happens when we offload even those reduced functions onto the machine. Very, very basic things, like the fact that my computer and my phone now do a great deal of my remembering for me. Right? Knowledge, ordinary knowledge that I used to have, you take. I'm sure you've had this experience, Andrew. I mean, you're driving around Dallas. The experience of once you begin using your GPS feature, which I use living in DC because it knows, so to speak, the shortest least traffic route out of half a dozen possible ways of traveling from point A to point B. So it's a really seductive and indispensable tool. But I don't know about you. I have noticed a real atrophy in my sense of direction, a real atrophy in the way that I pay attention to my surroundings and where I go, where I've been, that I could venture out to some place on the other side of town without GPS and just remember the directions in reverse. Mm-hmm. Something I used to do all the time.
Yeah.
Which I can't do anymore.
Yeah.
And I can't remember like I once did. So before we get even to the higher level philosophical loss of the loss of the capacity to reason through philosophical arguments about what's true or to see deeply into the meaning of things, even the most basic human preconditions, right? The things we used to cultivate in our children from a very early age, when we had them recite poetry or learn their multiplication tables or whatever. Basic cognitive functions get displaced.
Yeah, Professor Hanby, I was thinking about how I would imagine some technologists or enthusiasts for some technologies would say, look, I mean, your ability to know the streets in DC, that's good stuff to offload from your brain, because you don't need that there, and the machine can help you, which I totally disagree with. But the thing that really worries me about that is that it doesn't just stop at the information. I think it really extends to our ability to know truth, beauty, and goodness. And I want to offer just one funny example, and that just occurred to me when I was watching a movie the other night. I was watching the movie Manhattan, the Woody Allen movie, with my family. And there's this scene in Manhattan when Woody's character, Isaac, he's this television writer, and he writes this schlocky, lowest common denominator kind of junk for TV. And everybody loves it. Everybody thinks it is so incredibly hilarious. And he's standing in the control room talking to the producers or whatever. And he's just pulling his hair out. He's just this is garbage. I can't believe this. And they say, don't worry about it. Just take a Quaalude, just relax, And he says, look, you guys have no ability to judge comedy anymore. You don't even know what's good anymore. And so he decides to quit his job. And I was thinking about and this was back in the late 70s that he's doing this. And I was just thinking about what an apt kind of example, what a great example that was, kind of almost prophesying forward to where we are today, where we just don't even have the apparatus to kind of know what's good anymore.
Yeah, and of course, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Antón Barba-Kay's fantastic book that everyone's been talking about on life in our emerging digitocracy, the web of our own making. Yeah. But one of the things that he points out, and he's absolutely right about this, is one of the things that has made all of this so seductive, of course, is that it's absolutely frictionless, right? I mean, it's just, in fact, these technologies capitalize on our attention, right? It remembers what you've looked at, or divines what you've thought about, and feeds you more of that, whatever it is, and makes it as effortless as possible. I mean, just wait until we can walk into our grocery stores and walk out with our goods, and our biometric data will have been linked to our bank accounts, and we will have never had to have even undergone the friction of a checkout line or a kind of economic transaction. These things are extraordinarily difficult to resist. I mean, I liken that a little bit. Maybe the analogy breaks down, but to the schlock in your example that everybody is just gobbling up because it's so yummy and it's so easy. Now, the initial premise of your question, the technologists who say, or who are hypothetical technologists who would say, this is knowledge you need not waste your time in possessing, because we can, Google can possess it more accurately and more swiftly and put it to better use on your behalf. Those same people, of course, don't seem to have a great deal of concern for what is quintessentially and ineliminably human, either on the side of the soul, or for that matter, on the side of the body, right? So, one of the and I don't want to take the conversation in this direction because you're wanting to focus principally on AI, but one of the things that I tried to suggest in this talk was that the reduction of human intelligence to success in calculation and in the calculation and prediction and manipulation of nature, that yoked to medicine is a recipe for medicine itself becoming both a subject of ideological capture. I could put that more plainly. It's a recipe for medicine being colonized by ideology and being an agent of repression because of the peculiar kind of authority and power that it enjoys in our culture. So my sense is that a lot of your hypothetical technologists wouldn't necessarily have a great deal of trouble with all of that. They wouldn't regard the human body as placing any particular limit, the human body and its integrity and its given nature and functioning as placing any given limit on the power of technology, just as they don't regard sort of pesky little things like the human mind and human scale and questions of meaning as obstacles to the triumph of big data or something.
And I was thinking of you grading papers. You mentioned this in your speech.
As a former student,
I always am wondering. Okay, did you drink a beer when you graded my paper? But even to notice the difference, because I'm constantly having to look at these papers. I mean, it's one of the worst parts of the job, having to grade papers. But
you can only say that on this side of the desk that you're on, by the way.
Well, anyways, but sometimes, here it's a little bit easy because you got a lot of, non-native speakers. And so you kind of like, how is there no grammar errors in this paper? It has to absolutely be AI. And yet you type these things in to see whether or not with the AI checker, and then it says, oh, well, it's 65% human. I'm always wondering, how do they exactly get that 65%? But what I was thinking, because I was talking to one of my other colleagues, and it was just, well, okay, so long as all the facts are there and it kind of follows the basic rules of grammar. It follows, okay, this paragraph is about this theme, et cetera, et cetera. But I was thinking, well, how do we recognize this paper as good, as having some kind of depth to it that actually shows the skill of a real writer? And it just hit me that actually a lot of people just don't care. They don't recognize that difference. Could you say something about that? Whether or not we're even capable, like what Andrew said, to recognize, I mean, maybe I'm just reiterating this, of recognizing like good writing.
Yeah, or good. I mean, it's funny. You could pose that question to almost any area of life, right? I mean, the difference for us between, for example, high culture and low culture has been obliterated, right? As a culture, we don't really recognize the distinction. I mean, you think about the training and formation one has to undergo in order to be able to hear all that there is to hear in Renaissance polyphony, for example, or in Mozart. One of the reasons that I think classical music or real or sacred music falls so flat on a great many people is that they don't have the ears to hear it. Right. The same could be said with with respect to painting. Is it possible? I'll raise this as a hypothetical question. Is it possible? So you can phrase that, or you can think about those examples in terms of what capacities, what human qualities of perception the perceiver lacks. Right, someone who can't tell the difference between, or who can't judge why Mozart might be infinitely superior, for example, to Taylor Swift. Lacks a certain capacity to discriminate, lacks a certain capacity to hear all that there is in Mozart. And as I said just a second ago, you could apply an analogous example to the visual arts as well. Of course, it would then not only would that problem raise itself with respect to writing, but even to reality as a whole. Right, that we lose our capacity to perceive any depth in it, any depth of meaning. The profound, any sense of profound truth. That's a danger. Now, to completely reverse course now. The other interesting thing about your example, the example of students who use Chat GPT to write their papers, is it illustrates the very fact that Chat GPT can write a typical undergraduate student paper, for example, perhaps is illustrative of what human thinking has already been reduced to. I was thinking about this with respect to not with respect to this question of what is human in us, but with respect to human labor. I read an article the other day about all of the people in white collar jobs, right, who are now, when you think of automation replacing human workers, you tend to think of robots and replacing assembly line workers or something like that. One tends to think of what are traditionally regarded as blue collar jobs. But with AI now, automation has the possibility of replacing all kinds of white collar workers, perhaps even including physicians up to a point, or pilots, or financial analysts, or theology and philosophy professors. I don't know, but you name it. and the anxiety that this is causing among people who thought that because they work, with a laptop, that they were safe, and perhaps they're less safe even than the people who live in the world of things. As we saw during COVID, as the supply chain began to break down, a lot of those people are invisible, but it turns out they're quite important still. And it occurs to me that so much of our work is already configured, right? As if we were simply placeholders awaiting for the arrival of AI, right? That it doesn't involve any particular human depth of judgment such that it can't be replaced. I mean, I think there are intrinsic and endemic limitations to what AI can do because it is not, in fact, intelligence. It's a reduced image of intelligence, as we were discussing before. And yet so much of what it's replacing is a less efficient version of that. So that would be the flip side, I suppose, to the example that you raised. Not simply that we lose the capacity to judge and to perceive, but because we've lost that capacity to such a degree already, we're vulnerable to replacement.
Yeah, and it seems like that's the power that we have given to the technologies that we've created. And but then there are a lot of us standing around out here going, but who did give that power? Because I don't remember doing that. But it happens, and that's the thing that I struggle with.
Oh, I've always been found that astonishing. That and it's why I tend to regard technological order as more determinative and fundamental in the way that it governs us than political order, in fact, is. And I worry, in fact, that the coming AI possibilities will further spell the end of political order, that is to say, properly human self-government decision, because nobody asks, of course, when they interject something like this into the stream of history. I've used this example so many times, probably on your show previously. So, if someone is a real devotee of yours and remembers everything that's happened here, forgive me if I'm repeating myself, but I never knew. None of us did. None of us knew that we needed an iPhone. None of us. We didn't even know. I mean, those of us who lived in the before time. Never even knew to ask for it, couldn't conceive of it. So this thing that you can't even conceive, that you don't see coming, suddenly it's here, and before you know what hit you, all of our social relationships have been and the way we do business and the way we live has been transformed. That Barba-Kay book that I mentioned earlier, A Web of Our Own Making, describes this as what happened to us when we weren't looking. But I think what happened to us when we weren't looking is kind of built into the logic of technology itself. That modern technology, which has, is not just a tool, but is meant to increase human power beyond what mere tools allow us to accomplish, which is why they, tend to master us in the way that they do. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I didn't ask for this. But none of us is free of having to negotiate within or around the world that this has created.
What do you think really is behind this, though? I mean, is it just the drive, like, I don't know, to make more money? I mean, it seems to me that there's something like perhaps maybe very American about this. And I apologize to all those Americans who might be sensitive to my constant critiques, but it just, you mentioned John Dewey in the piece and a certain way of thinking that really kind of comes to its culmination with him. And I know you've done a lot of work in looking at America and politics in America and kind of what the technological way of thinking that perhaps even in a way, let's say, sets up how we think about politics. But could you maybe say something about it? Because also too, like you think about America and life on the frontier. You know, I forget the name of that famous work where it's about the frontiers, the next, the next thing to accomplish, moving. And then we get to the West, then we go into space, and then we have the internet. And this just seems to me like the next thing, because it's like, why do I need this? And I mean, when I say that to my students, why do I need this thing? They give me like 100 reasons. How could you live without this? I mean, and they're very, very like passionate in defending this thing, as if, if I'm like, oh, well, I remember a time when it didn't exist, and I was
Yeah.
I was quite okay without
Yeah.
it.
Well, I suspect for them, that time is unimaginable,
Hmm.
right? Because I won't say you and I, because you're a generation or so behind me, but you're probably the last generation to have straddled the before and the after. Everyone who is born now will be born inside the internet, so to speak, and it will be such an integral part of how they and the society that they're a part of lives. It would be like us trying to unthink electricity, which is scarcely conceivable. Um, and that's frightening, considering. I mean, that's frightening if its effects on us are as we have described. Now, I mean, obviously, in its reach and in its use and in its effects, um, digital media, artificial intelligence, all of that is not obviously not confined to the American landscape. It's not confined to anything, right? That's what it obliterates all forms of confinement. Um, but you're suggesting that there's something kind of quintessentially American about it, and I think that's probably right. And like you suggested, and you yourself were saying, I do think this question of the meaning of America, the logic of it's the soul, as it were, what it is that drives America as a society, the novelty that it represents with respect to the old world is a really fascinating question, and quite a deep one, actually, that is taking on a new shape in the light of these kinds of developments. I think some of the old pieties that still float around in our politics, but which increasingly seem to be falsifying themselves in real time, no longer stick. And it's one of the things people are restless to try and figure out. But one deep aspect, constitutive aspect of American life, it seems to me, and the thing that differentiates it fundamentally from Europe, and for that matter, even those New World cultures that have uh, more Mediterranean and Catholic roots, and also had flourishing civilizations that had to be contended with more so than North America did. One of the things that really differentiates us is the absolute exaltation of possibility, of every kind of possibility. I mean, no people on earth celebrates the idea, again, that all things are possible, right? Whether it's class ability, whether it's the conquest of nature, whether it's the conquest of the continental frontier, whether it's the conquest of space, whether it's the digital conquest of time and space, whether it's any limitation whatsoever, no one celebrates and exalts and makes a part of their self-understanding, their national self-understanding, um, sheer possibility and the idea that all things are possible. Someone pointed out to me that what was it that Donald Trump said in his second inaugural? Impossibility, the impossible is what we do best. I think that's the line. Something very, very, very like that. It actually captures this perfectly, and and the very fact that that a statement like that is so banal and taken from 1,000 different commercials. I've seen any number Microsoft or Apple commercials that essentially say the same thing, just reflect how deeply ingrained in us this is. And the thing about the possible, right, is that it is because it's not actual, it's infinite. You know, and as Aristotle says, the infinite can't be traversed. So you never get to the end of it. It's interminable, without end. And so there can be no resting point, no stopping place for progress. And, you know, when you exalt possibility in that way, any given limitation tends to be regarded a priori as a kind of obstacle to be overcome. Mm-hmm. Whether that's in the political sphere, you know, in the sphere of liberation, where I need to now be liberated from my own nature, or from, you know, economic inequality, or whether it's in the technical sphere. The two things tend to mirror each other. So you add that to the fact, you know, you have the almost mandatory lure of the possible. Because this is what it is for us to know the world, right? Is to conquer it, to take it apart, put it back together, reassemble it, do things with it that haven't been done before. You add to that the fact that these previous conquests pile up, right? And the accumulated effects of the pile up shape our thought and action in ways that we were already describing, right? Our children are going to be born into the world of the internet and digital media and AI and all the rest of it. That's going to be the world in which they're breathing and trying to find their way. They're going to have no choice but to respond to that. And so that creates and dictates certain problems that will require a technical solution to get out of. I think that's another aspect of this. And then finally, and I mentioned this in several pieces, I think I mentioned it in this one as well. There's the fact that it's very curious that we tend not to know, for all sorts of complex reasons, the meaning of what we're doing, or the real nature of the technological interventions that we're introducing. Right, and so with something like the iPhone, you have to find out what it's for after you've already done it, after you've already got it, right? An example that I use over and over again is Twitter, right? Which at least a few years ago was essentially a spigot for the flow of information. Right, you could turn it on, you could turn it off, and dictate, as it were, what's in the public square, what's permitted to appear, what's not permitted to appear. I doubt that when Jack Dorsey and his friends invented it, they had any idea that that's what they were creating. My understanding was they thought they were creating a platform for group messaging. You know, and you come to discover, actually, I have a tool for controlling the world. Sometimes, and then that generates that the tool be used in certain ways, or be put to certain uses that weren't anticipated when it was created. That kind of thing happens over and over and over again. So that all goes into the stew of attempting to answer your question about what's kind of quintessentially American about all of this. But I would put the absolute exaltation of endless possibility at the foundation of it, as one of the foundational pieces.
Yeah, and it seems like Americans are pretty much fine with the idea that you mentioned in the piece, the Augusto Del Noce idea of sort of technology creating a semi-culture, or maybe even a kind of no culture. I mean, I think your typical American would sort of say, yeah, I mean, if we have certain things, then that's fine, but maybe we won't have them tomorrow. But that's just the way it is. You know, we don't submit ourselves to a culture. Everything's always changing, and we don't know. And I think that that's a very alien idea to many peoples of the earth. But the technology that's going to wash over all of us is going to kind of subsume that, in them as well, perhaps.
Yeah. I mean, do we have a culture?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say that we do.
Yeah. No, even, historically speaking,
Yeah.
right? We don't have deep roots. I just gave a talk at the New Polity Conference in Steubenville on are we a people? We don't have deep roots, and the things that sort of emerge from the soil that bind us together, a deep history together, a common faith, even for that matter, a common home. The continual restlessness of Americans in moving westward, not incidentally, a very, very short span of historical time, comparatively speaking. I mean, what transpired between the 1780s and the 1880s is breathtaking. And you could argue that insofar as Americans have a culture in common, that culture is by and large the product of a culture industry.
Mm-hmm.
That alters the very nature of culture pretty fundamentally. And for one thing, it's also dependent upon its technological propagation. So, if that's the world we've been born into, and in which we live and move and have our being, and the water that we drink, and all of the various metaphors to describe this, probably the reason that we're, as you put it, okay with this is because the process we were describing earlier has already so far advanced in us that we simply don't know what we're missing.
Right.
We don't see what we don't see. We don't know what we don't know. There are certain questions that are not meaningful for us to ask. They can become meaningful through through accidents of encounter and education. You encounter the tradition in some way, and you're plunged into a line of ancient thinking that you didn't know existed, and you come to see not possibilities, but even realities that had not have occurred to you before. But that's a kind of accidental experience with respect to American culture more generally, I think.
Yeah, there's I mean, I'm thinking about, even the songs that we listen to, and maybe some songs that, catch on in amongst people. It's just because those songs so often are just played so often at certain moments that you just somehow there's a memory form there, and you just want to go back to that. But
Well, think about what you just said, right? Songs that are played.
yeah,
I mean, that's a novel thing. The idea that music is something that's played and that you listen to, rather than, for example, something you make,
mhm.
right? That's handed down. These aren't aren't the songs that we sang around the hearth or in the fields. These are songs that we've heard on the radio, or people don't listen to radio anymore. Songs that we're now streaming, and they're all reproduced. That would be an example of the phenomenon or the process that I was trying to get at in response to Andrew's question. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I couldn't resist. And we're used to it, right? I mean, I love Apple Music. I've got what I think is a fantastic musical library that I can go for days and not hear the same song twice. I mean, there's that frictionlessness again, right? But what a peculiar thing it is that I'm listening to pre-recorded music by somebody else that's sold. That's
and
not the same.
yeah,
That's a different sense of culture.
Yeah, in best case scenario, it was, there were actual human beings who knew how to play instruments and all that sort of thing. But increasingly, and this is something we've learned from Ted Gioia, I mean, that increasingly these playlists on Apple, like not the ones you make from the music that you love, but like just the ones that you just kind of dial up, are full of AI created music. And nobody cares because it doesn't matter. It's just the product. It's just put something in my ears, and it's a brave new world, to borrow a popular phrase, right?
Yeah,
Bobby,
but
sorry, I cut you off.
no. But to bring up this, I was taking a look at this book called Surveillance Capitalism, and it's just interesting, like with all the big data as being kind of like the gold of today. Why are these products all kind of free? Why do you have Pokemon Go? All this stuff just to kind of like collect information on us, where we end up becoming the very products itself. And it just seems like, the kind of alien, like you mentioned C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man, and I have to agree with you. I think that is the best, and it's one of my favorite books. I used to have that on, of all things, a CD that I got the recording somewhere from the library and I burned it on a CD. So the CD, I listened to that thing like 25 times. And I just have it like ingrained in me. Let's see if I can like recall much of it. But he's like, we've then in some ways dissected the world and, like conquered the world and nature. But then now we're going to conquer ourselves and turn it inward. And, then he kind of ends with like, once you kind of like gone, you end up not seeing anything because you've pulled everything off. But I was
Seeing
thinking,
through is the same as not seeing.
yeah. But I was thinking
Beautiful.
too, with all of this stuff on collecting the big data, like today, the number one job today you see on all these reports is to go into data analysis and data, and collecting that in some way. So today we're just basically, how are these technologists viewing us? I mean, I have to say something. I don't really have a very good view of all these technologists. I used to in college. I remember there was this undergrad. In undergrad, there was a guy in technology, and the way he was talking about his dating life was so disturbing to me, that he saw everybody as just kind of this like instrument for accomplishing further ends for him, but he didn't even know what it was that he really wanted to do. But everybody was just a means to another end. And that really bothered me. And now that we have like the cultural icon be Elon Musk, who, wants to be like the next Genghis Khan and spread his seed around the world, right, through, IVF, it just bothers me that we have this guy being upheld. But like, even for his own dignity, what are these things that he's creating going to do to him? But anyways, I'm just looking at collecting all the data on us. Could you say something about that? Like, what is it? How is it viewing us as something like a standing reserve, as Heidegger says?
Yeah. But by the way, Surveillance Capitalism is a great book. Um, I recommend it. I think it has some limitations to it, and I think the Barba-Kay book that I mentioned is a really nice supplement and corrective to it in some ways. Um, the Shoshanna Zubroff, who wrote Surveillance Capitalism, makes a distinction between what she calls instrumentarian and totalitarian power, and this kind of because she's interested in not just the sort of subjective consequences, but the social and macro political consequences of these kinds of technologies and this kind of capturing of data that you're describing. And she says that in contrast to totalitarianism, instrumentarianism is not interested in the soul, and in the shape of your soul. And I would say, in response to that, read Barba-Kay and then tell me that again. It's not true. The corrective comes in the way that he is, and it's not, when I call it a corrective, he's not positioning that book over against Zuboff in any way that I'm aware of, but just that there's a real neglected dimension here that he picks up on, having to do with the way that we're shaped by this, that she neglects. Now, that was a long way of getting out of your question and trying to buy myself a little bit of time to think about it. I mean, it's disturbing, for one thing, right? That Google knows more about you and remembers more about you than you know and remember about yourself. And one can imagine all manner of ways in which that could be abused. On the other hand, it knows those things about you in what is necessarily kind of a two-dimensional flat way that will never be true to the reality, right? And I think about the way in which the various ways in which we are encouraged that, in this virtual culture, this virtual semi-culture or anti-culture, perhaps we should say. But the ways in which we are not just encouraged, but almost compelled to pass judgment on people and their images, and to reprove them for various kinds of thought crimes against prevailing orthodoxies or what have you. And as this world, as the real public square moves online, right, as the virtual public square becomes the public square, we've seen all kinds of ways already. We got an inkling of this during COVID, and between 2020 and 2024, of the ways in which you can be essentially unpersoned for transgressing the acceptable norms because of the way these media dominate, because of their involvement in our banking, because of the accessibility of information. People who lost their access to their own ability to bank, for example, or to monetize their own products because social media companies decided, or corporations based on information that they saw in people's public profiles, decided that they were not acceptable to do business with and sort of deprive them of these opportunities. I mean, there's some really harrowing depictions in a couple of different places. Some in the Barba-Kay book. I believe there are also some in the Zubroff book, but elsewhere also, of the way that the social credit system operates in China, for example. We began to see intimations of that over here. And this is, a few years ago. And this is all made possible by this collection and interfacing and publication of this kind of data. It's very worrisome. Your actual, physical movement and your capacity to live can be greatly hindered by the abuses of these things. And it's not clear, it's very hard to legislate against what you can't anticipate, right? So, and of course, we can't anticipate all the possibilities that these technologies contain. So it's only after the crisis has been created, we're in a permanently reactive position to trying to do something about it.
Yeah, and this is a good place to maybe point to the end, where we maybe contemplate for a second what to do about it, because this is always the thing that I'm sure people throw in your face, Professor, and as people do in ours. It's like, well, if you're going to complain about these things, what's the solution? And I mean, I suppose, on the one hand, it was fashionable for a while for people to talk about different options, right? Where maybe we could even pursue kind of individual lives or lives with a small group of people where we could just choose that we weren't going to participate somehow. I'm pretty skeptical of that. Anyway, probably not the life I'm going to pick. Maybe there's some like heroic activity that could be done, like, Ethan Hunt and the IMF team in Mission Impossible, where they could like destroy AI once and for all or something. That also seems unlikely. Or maybe we're going to get, hit by a meteor or something, and that's just going to end the discussion no matter what. Again, so all of that is kind of to one side. But it seems like, what you suggest at the end of your piece is pretty much where I land too, which is, I guess all we can do is just try to do the most human thing imaginable, which is to actually try to understand this and try to contemplate it a little bit. I don't know, maybe your closing thoughts kind of in that vein.
Well, that has been my answer to this question, which is not a satisfying answer, but I think it's an indispensable one. I don't think philosophy is the only human thing left to us that we can do. And I do wonder, actually, I mean, talk of options aside, I do wonder if the kind of virtual social world created by AI and digital media are are going to widen the chasm between people who live in the world of things and people who live on screens. Now, those aren't entirely mutually exclusive, and the point of AI is to colonize one with the other. But nevertheless, we have not yet figured out how to get AI to build a house, or to pave a road, or to do any number of things. And part of me wonders whether, in fact, this might not open up something like two economies. And this might actually be a hopeful sign. Whether we have, because you're already seeing, you live in Dallas, I live in Washington. These are cities that are increasingly becoming kind of gated community, little atomistic gated communities surrounded by chaos, right? I mean, I can have almost everything. I can arrange pretty much not to have to leave my house and have most necessities brought to me by people that I don't have to look at or acknowledge. But if I go down the street to Walgreens, right, I have to get a security guard to unlock the toothpaste, right? We're abandoned. Public spaces are being abandoned and left to kind of rot and die, while we build little virtual gates around ourselves and have the world brought to us. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if it's going to open up a kind of chasm between people who live on either sides of those, greater than there is already, which will, of course, mean more social unrest, more danger and things like that. But it might also mean that there are economies and there are spaces that emerge in which it's possible once again to do more human things.
Yeah.
So human beings and human nature are pretty resilient. They're like kudzu. They just sort of grow up. You pave over it, or you trim it back, or you chop away at it. Here it comes again. And I'm hopeful that there's more that we can do than simply understand how bad it is. Even though I do think that understanding how bad it is, and understanding more generally, and understanding the goodness in the light of which we can judge how bad it is a fundamental human task that we need to jealously cultivate and guard.
Yeah, and it occurs to me, Bobby, maybe you want to chime in with one more thing, but one sign of hope that I look to is there are people in this world, if you look, who are spending hours and hours and hours not, we swim in the water. That's the way that it is. But there are people who spend hours and hours and hours every week doing something else. Yeah. I mean, my teenage daughter is a competitive dancer. She dances 20 hours a week. That's 20 hours of a young person's time that's not going into looking at a screen or subjecting herself to kind of the torrents of technology, right? I mean, I just have to think that's going to continue. Yeah, I very much hope.
My sons played baseball and gave that kind of time to it, and I thought it was great for them. I think it's a good reminder to all of us to close these things down and go do human things.
Well, on that note,
and there are people.
I just want to say, because part of the thing that Andrew and I are trying to do is eventually get people into these cities, and particularly the cities that we just talked to Philip Bess, who's a great, kind of urbanist and architect from Notre Dame. Last week we talked about
good guy.
Ballparks, yeah. But today I was in the Rynek of the main square in Krakow, and I just love going there, and I just can sit and just watch people. But everybody gathers there. And today I was reading in preparation for this the Question Concerning Technology by Heidegger, which critique Heidegger all you want. I think this is a great essay.
Yeah, no,
but he has this line here, which he talks about which Goethe has this special fondness for a poem in which he talks about the German word. I forget about connecting the German word. Now, correct me with my German, Weissen, with meaning city hall, connected to the word die Weisserei, okay, with city hall. And um, he says, inasmuch as the life of the community gathers and the village existence is constantly in play. And he talks about this as like kind of an unfolding. Um, and anyways, I could elaborate on this, but like the kind of going towards the essence of something as kind of something like the city hall, where people gather and you have this unfolding that takes place. I was thinking how all these things kind of like relate to each other. You know, like what we're trying to do is kind of to focus on these, if you want to say these, the danger that maybe then would bring, in some ways, may save us in a way. But it then brings to light all these things that do endure, that we should actually place our hope in, more or less. That all, in some ways, like Philip Bess's book, are anticipations of the heavenly Jerusalem. So, anyways, I mean, I just like it that when we're talking about all these things from different angles, you know, with AI, with, you know, baseball, city ballparks, and they're, you know, like Chesterton, they say, could connect, you know, the liturgy with like an octopus and find a connection there. But I hope what we're trying to do is connect all those things and say that there is something that unites them, and we're trying to articulate that. So, Dr. Hanby, thank you. I mean, I feel like, you know, this conversation went in many different directions, but I feel like there is some kind of like connecting thread to it.
Yeah, I hope you can, you know, pull together a show out of it. We were a bit all over the map. I apologize for that. It's kind of been a long day already, but so my mind probably wandered a bit too much. But you know, as always, I've enjoyed talking with you guys. It's always a lot of fun, and I always see things, you know, a little bit differently. And yeah, I hope one of the things that AI does, and our virtual world does, is it proposes or promises in some ways to leave that world where we gathered behind, right, and to leave those spaces behind. And you know, your invocation of Heidegger there raises a really interesting question about what's the relationship between our ability to penetrate to the essence of things, right? To have the kinds of experiences and the thought that we are talking about that we seem to be losing our grip on, and the survival of those spaces, right? The survival of a res publica, of public things that are actually things, and places and spaces that aren't just left to their own devices while we communicate at the speed of light on opposite sides of the world.
Yeah,
I don't know. We'll find out.
Let's just hope that even if people go to Paris and they're equally awed by the Pompidou Center and Notre Dame, at least they're awed by Notre Dame. You know, at least, even if they like the bad stuff too, let's give thanks that the good stuff is still there. Our guest today has been Michael Hanby of the John Paul II Institute at the Catholic University of America. We want all of you to go out and read Artificial Ignorance, which we're going to link in the show notes. Professor Hanby, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, guys. It's been great.
For all of our viewers and listeners, thank you so much for spending time with us today. We ask for your prayers as we continue to have these interesting conversations and share them with you for the good of the world and the good of the church. So until next time, live in hope, and God bless you all.